Hey, Elon.
Elon. Moss. Elon. Yeah, Elon. I mean, people tell me Elon Musk kind of. And that's how. Actually, my father changed his name over the holiday. And, I'm not with my iteration. Position. Elon. I think the that doesn't work. Elon. But Elon, Elon,
But the accent on the air.
yeah, Elon,
Yeah, well, that's different.
model.
Yeah. So we have
Yeah. Yeah, people are really like a lot. They're like a block from they're on the way.
we got a whole set of tower. they're just called UN Fellows? There you go. Oh, right. Let's try.
Watching me take
I, So we have Bell from okay. Okay. So you're gonna have to it's over there.
Need more audience. Welcome to Climate Week. I'm Alex Moore. I'm the chair of the week-long program here, and in my day job, I'm also a climate and health scientist with a very deep voice at UMass Boston and Harvard and the Climate Change Institute. Today, we are going to talk about the twin crises. I know that this has been used for a bunch of other things, but in this particular case, we are referring to how climate affects health, which if you were alive this summer, you probably figured out that it actually does have an impact on you, because when it's 140 degrees out, you tend not to fare so well. Before we move into our program, I'd like to thank Meredith and Peter Kellner for their generosity, for supporting this whole week. And in particular, Peter was going to introduce this panel, but he could not be here. I would also like to acknowledge our UN Journalism Fellows who are here today. and possibly not all here, possibly still stuck in traffic on the expedition on the Upper East Side. And also, I'd like to acknowledge our students from Queens College, brought by Professor Sakar. One of the missions of the club is to educate the public, and we do that here every night during Climate Week. I would also like to acknowledge the committee, the Climate Week committee, particularly Ann Passer and Ted Janulis, who have been outstanding partners in over 4 years. This is the 4th edition of this program. And I'd like to acknowledge the staff. I always do this, but it's important because not everyone is here always. Kevin Murphy, Brooke Veos, Felix Freeland, Brittany Barbazat, Alex Serrano, and Luis Muga. Please give them a hand. And Jake Sheriff, I think I got your name right. All right, good. Jenna O'Connor, Lacey Flint, and Bonnie Wiper. If you saw the installation downstairs and also in the library later on, when those installations are made by Lacey, who is an amazing archivist and also our curator in the club. We could not do anything here without them, so it's really important to acknowledge. Before I start introducing our speakers for tonight, I'm going to frame why we're here. And as I said, I kind of work on this particular topic. And here is your state. I don't actually live here, although I did until August of 2022. Oh, no, that's where we want to be. And this is Lyme disease in the last 15 years. And the blue is the Adirondack Park. And this is how it has progressed in just 15 years. If you thought that climate is not affecting your health, think again. It is a clear and present danger. We also removed all the top predators from, called wolves, and that actually, we've doubled the length of the summer. So we've made it a paradise for ticks and a hell for us. I know this is a little doomy, but please bear with me. I like doomy things, and I try to kind of spin them. In 2020, my team and I figured out what the cause, or at least one of the worsening causes of the Spanish flu, the largest pandemic in the history of man by number of victims, was, and it was a major, massive climate anomaly that lasted 5 years on top of Europe, which you may have seen in photos of the battlefields of Europe, because this was also the time of World War I, excuse me. And it caused lots of rain, and it just turned out, and I'm not going to go into the details, but it turned out that if you look at deaths over the same time, you see a double peak right there, right around the time of the Spanish flu. And that's because we stopped the migration of animals that actually carry that disease. And we're doing that today. We're not so much stopping it as we're deviating or changing where animals go. And we don't see this, but it's happening around us all the time. And Marie is going to tell us more about that. She's a leading scientist in this particular topic. And you can see you may have seen these things in, K-12 textbooks. The water that was constantly falling all over Europe for 4 years during the war. Lyme disease again, here, northeast. If you look at the cases, they follow a 3-degree increase in temperature. This is also from Climate Change Institute and my work. So I'd like you tonight to start thinking not in a linear fashion, cause and effect, but rather as we do as scientists, and this is the hardest thing in this cause and effect. And we're only going to talk about a few of those causes today, but this is reality. And reality is interdisciplinary, and today you're going to see a lot of that. Okay? So next, you can go to black. Next, it is my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce Marie Victoria Lilly, who's a scientist at Columbia University, researching vector-borne diseases, vector-borne disease transmission in cities, and using her research to shape risk management policies with an eye toward environmental justice. In a previous work, she studied how social and ecological factors influence zoonotic disease, that is, disease that jumps from animals to humans, and that is most disease that is a pandemic today. There are multiple pandemics happening, you just don't know about it. Emergence and so zoonotic disease emergence and transmission, particularly Lyme transmission on the West Coast. Yes, it has reached the West Coast. Welcome, Marie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Marie, and I'm currently a PhD recent candidate, passed my orals, at Columbia University in the Eco-Epidemiology Lab. And today I'll be just introducing a little bit about our changing climate, the rise of vector-borne disease, and ticks specifically on the move. Okay, so to start with, as you just saw in the introduction, infectious diseases are all around the world rising in prevalence and also emerging, meaning there are new pathogens that are being discovered and that are increasing. And an estimated 75% of these emerging diseases and 60% of already established diseases are zoonotic in origin, meaning that they come from an animal host to start with. And these cause billions of cases of illness per year, so it's a huge problem. And vector-borne diseases specifically, so those transmitted by an insect like a mosquito or a tick, cause a disproportionate share of all emerging diseases. And I included this here just with the world's deadliest animals. You see mosquitoes ringing in above everything else. And it's obviously, well, of course, it's not the mosquito itself, but the pathogen that the mosquito transmits. Okay, so how does climate factor into all of this? Well, this infographic put together in a Nature paper shows how all these different climate hazards and things that are happening with global climate change, such as rising temperature, rainfall increase, land cover change, or a couple that I would highlight, are increasing the number or are making worse a large quantity of diseases, such as vector-borne diseases like mosquito-transmitted diseases and tick-borne disease. And specifically, rising temperatures with mosquitoes can increase the amount of time that they can bite people, and with ticks, it also increases the amount of time they're searching for a host. Okay, so vector-borne diseases are on the rise, and it is actually ticks that are responsible for the largest number of new pathogens that we're just now learning about. And that is the focus of my research right now. So tick-borne diseases in the United States are pretty widespread. However, you'll notice the Northeast, which is the region we are all currently sitting in, has the highest number of tick-borne diseases reported every year, and that is increasing. And the tick that is responsible for most of these diseases is called the black-legged tick, and it is extremely small. It's pretty widespread. And this, you can kind of get a sense of the size, but how many of you have seen one of these ticks before, just by a show of hands? Okay, that's great. That's a lot of you, but it's not all of you. Hopefully it wasn't on you. But they're very small. And the ones you may have seen, were probably in adults, because the nymphs are the size of a poppy seed. And the CDC put out this kind of disturbing infographic to see if you can spot the 5 ticks that are placed on this lemon poppy seed muffin. Do you think you see them, all 5? Not all 5? Okay, well, there they are, all 5 right there. They blend right in. And I actually brought some tick samples I can pass around just so you can really get a sense. I'll actually just start passing around now, if that's okay. Okay, I'll start with you. Anyway, in there are a few different species and life stages. So the nymph is often the most dangerous because it's so small. But you'll see in there, they're all pretty small. Okay, another tick that is increasing its distribution and prevalence all over the United States, and especially in the Northeast, is the Lone Star tick. And you might have heard of it because of a bunch of headlines recently about the red meat allergy caused by this tick. So I'm a vegetarian, won't affect me, but about 500,000 people in the United States are currently living with this red meat allergy, and that can obviously alter your life pretty significantly or be fatal if you go into anaphylactic shock, which it has caused. So the driving questions that I'm interested in looking at are, how does the urban landscape structure wildlife host movement, because ticks require a host to take a blood meal, such as deer and mice. Then the ecological and the social context, how does that all shape tick-borne disease risk? And then the next part is, how can we best target equitable disease management strategies to reduce the burden of infectious disease? And my research is focused on urban green spaces because they provide many benefits to human well-being as well as climate regulation, but they can also, which is great, but they can also have the potential to increase human contact and exposure to ticks and tick-borne disease when they provide habitat for wildlife and their hosts. Bad. Okay, so my current and future work, right now I'm using urban landscape structure, tick, pathogen, and wildlife distribution to uncover kind of key areas for intervention. And you don't really have to pay too close attention to this, but it's just a map that I created with data that I collected all around New York City and Long Island, showing kind of these key regions that might be at greater risk for targeting tick-borne disease intervention. And that's based on like wildlife movement patterns and then the ticks themselves. And then the next part is understanding social responses to ticks and tick-borne pathogens to strategize management plans, and that's through a ton of different surveys of people using parks, as well as my lab has an app called the Tick app, little plug, you can download it. That gets at people's experiences with ticks and their risk perception and how they're responding. And we're finding that a lot of whether or not people do protect themselves from ticks is related to their past experiences. So all of those you who raised your hand having seen a tick before might be more likely to use personal protection measures than others. And then education level is also important, so educational campaigns could really help here. And then right now I'm working with Pfizer to apply this research towards targeting their vaccine distribution. So some take-home points from this: climate change is contributing to an alarming rise in vector-borne disease. Ticks transmit the most new pathogens and are spreading geographically across the US. And then integrating ecology, sociology, and epidemiology is necessary to understand and reduce tick-borne disease, especially in urban areas. And lastly, hopefully you get the sense that further research is very much needed in this area. So, thank you.
That was awesome. I want that map. I want the map of Long Island. I was hanging out in Comsett State Park. It's bright white. Pardon? I did a tick check. Next, we have our friend and fellow Ilan Moss, who was trained as a journalist for 15 years of experience communicating for United Nations agencies and nonprofits in North America, Europe, Africa, and Southeast Asia. He's joined the Drugs for Neglected Diseases initiative in 2015, where he still works. He has worked with the U.S. Department of State as a global health communications consultant, training reporters during the 2014 West Africa Ebola outbreak, and in 2017 trained 30 provincial health directors in the Democratic Republic of Congo to better respond to disease outbreaks. Journalists are, in fact, saving the world. Please, applause to all journalists. Last night we had Bill Weir. We are very friendly to journalists here, and we should be, because they go places we don't go and tell us stories that we need to know. Ilan's work has been published in Reuters, Guardian, The Observer, and many other major news outlets. And today he'll treat us to a visual journey of how climate is shaping current pandemics around the world. Yes, as I said, there's more than one pandemic, and they are rising. And here is Ilan.
Thank you so much. So I just used this green thing, right? So where do you guys think this is? Did I actually have a, no? Any thoughts? Close. So this is Sri Lanka. This was a couple months ago. I don't remember anymore. I think it was about 5 months ago. So I work for DNDi. We were founded by Doctors Without Borders to develop drugs for neglected tropical diseases. And dengue, I'm going to talk about dengue. I'm sorry, more bad news, more doom and gloom, is not the most climate-sensitive disease, but it sure really feels like it. This is a dengue outbreak in Sri Lanka in the city of Colombo. In which some of you might know, but if you've ever been to Paris, have you ever been to the 13e arrondissement, the 13th? This was happening in the 13th this summer because there was a mini dengue outbreak in Paris. So it's coming to you, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about what's happening around the world, because I think we can say, yes, there was a couple of cases in Florida, but what's happening now, what's happening this year, are repeated dengue outbreaks. I'm sure some of you have been seeing, but every region, every continent. So we have Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Bolivia. There's Argentina. Peru was a really desperate one with lots of child deaths. And Florida, which I don't know if you count that as a foreign country. I do. And then you'll see over there, sorry, you have Malaysia, Peru, Bolivia. Just look at that spike. Now, this is also due to COVID restrictions coming down, but there's something else happening. There we go. What's happening here? So I have 3 quick graphs for you. This one, it's a little hard because it just kind of looks like the same colors here, but this is from a study. There's still, I'm sure there's some scientists in the audience. There's still, there's data, but the science is ongoing about whether climate change or how climate change is affecting dengue. What's sure from these mapping techniques is we see predictions of, in this case, I'm not going to go into the details of dengue, but of the Aedes mosquito. So this is the tiger mosquito. This is the mosquito that transmits dengue. It's a virus. By the way, it's a virus. So I'm a fellow at this club, and I'm sometimes known as the warm guy, because I go to DRC, I go to the Congo, and I come back with all kinds of worm infections. But tonight, I'm the virus guy. So this one is, I think, is a lot more powerful. So this is, you all know mosquitoes in rainy season. I don't need to talk about that. But this is basically mapping, if nothing is done, what the world is going to look like as far as rainy seasons where dengue transmission can happen. So this is powerful. And there's something else, and then I'm going to go away from the science and into something a little more visual. But dengue, we found, is also, there's another, I'd say, almost a double-edged sword of patients that have, just like COVID, diabetes, obesity, various non-communicable diseases are more at risk of developing severe dengue and dying. And at the same time, we're seeing, almost a pandemic of NCDs, obesity in countries like Thailand. And this is really raising just the bar on dengue and causing more, I'm not going to say deaths, we're going to talk about that in a second, but definitely causing more just societal damage because of these dengue outbreaks. It's dark. So I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to bring you to Colombo. Has anyone been to Sri Lanka here or is from Sri Lanka? Amazing place. Fantastic people. It's been a rough few years. It's been a rough, long time, but it's an inspiring place. It's a little dark, but this is the dengue ward. It's at the, in Colombo. It's an old colonial hospital called the Infectious Diseases Hospital, IDH. And I was there in, was it January? Oh my God. All right, so I was there in January. It's almost a year ago. I thought it was 5 months. I was there as part of a film a documentary we're making on dengue. We filmed in Brazil, and we filmed in Sri Lanka, and we're going to film, hopefully, in Malaysia with my friends over there, but we'll have to look into that soon. But this is in the midst of a dengue outbreak. So this is the Infectious Disease Hospital in Colombo. There's one thing you're going to see in any dengue outbreak is you're going to see slammed hospitals, exhausted health workers, just like COVID. And you're going to see people in the hallway because there's no room. And oops, what happened? It went back. Sorry. There's no room in the hospital anymore. There's no room for beds. Now, why is it? I mean, COVID, we know why the ICUs were packed. But for dengue, there's no treatment for dengue. We're going to talk about that, obviously, a little more later. But there's no treatment. So the only thing you can do to keep people from developing severe dengue is to monitor their symptoms. So we're going to see that. So you need to be hospitalized. There's no pill. There's no intravenous. There's nothing that you can get that will cure you of dengue. Now, I think this is one of the most common viral mosquito-borne pathogens in the world, yet there's no treatment. So you're going to see hospital workers absolutely slammed. So this is happening all over the world. It's happening now. It's been happening this year. Beds full of patients, relatives, sitting on the floor. And this, I mean, I think this photo is really powerful. And the photographer is a South African photographer named Xavier Vaihed. Sorry, I forgot to put the credit on at the end. He'll kill me, but I can share it later. But you see the watch hanging from her blouse. That's critical, because you need to go by every 4 hours and check the levels and make sure people are not literally leaking fluids into their lungs, because that's how you develop severe dengue. This image is repeated again and again. But there's something else which really struck me in Colombo this year, and it's the learner's ward. So we have some students here. And why is there a learner's ward in dengue? So you guys know what the A levels are? Anyone? Yeah, so it's the British, is it like the SATs, or it's kind of like, yeah, basic education. So the A levels happen in Colombo at the same time as sort of the tail end of the monsoon season. So they've actually created a ward in the dengue ward so students can study that to have dengue and take their exams in the ward, take their exams with dengue. And it was one of the most, I mean, I've worked on Ebola outbreaks, et cetera, but this thing really struck me the most as a parent, as someone who almost went insane homeschooling my kids during COVID. And you see, obviously everyone had signed their consent. Everyone was fine with us doing this, because these are mostly adolescents. You have mothers repeatedly by the bedsides praying for their kids, not only that they get better, but also that they do good on the A levels, because the A levels are really important in Sri Lanka. It's an extremely success-oriented society. The A levels decide everything. And you know what? They are taken to the hospital. You can see in the next photos with stents in their hands to sit their exams, algebra, geography, history, with dengue, because there is really no other thing to do. They're studying, in this case, physics in the bed. Now, this is, again, dengue has anyone had dengue here? So I don't know what level you had, but yeah. So most of these kids were in the hospital because they probably had second infection of dengue, so they were having a stronger dengue reaction. So it's bad COVID, but I mean, you can't think, but these kids study all night long. And actually in the wards, you hear the mothers doing Buddhist prayers as the kids study. And it's just, I called my kids and I was like, you think you have a hard time? And then finally, the students are brought in to sit the exams on hospital beds with the exam wardens watching them. And they do it. And this is because there's a lot of reasons behind this. It's also because the parents want their kids to succeed, and they're not going to change the A levels because of a dengue outbreak. But it's because there are more dengue outbreaks. They're longer, and they're happening in greater frequency. Why? It's very clear it's climate change. And you'll see this again and again. It's not just kids in the school. It's families. It's wage earners that are out of work for a month that can no longer make their daily wage. And I have to say, it's a pretty, this is a doom and gloom story, but there is a happy ending to this. And this is who should be giving this presentation. So this is my colleague. I have another colleague from my organization sitting in the back from Colombia, Christina. But this is our colleague, Dr. Nalika. So she's the Anthony Fauci of Sri Lanka. So she is leading the dengue program for my organization, DNDI. And I'm going to talk about this just really quickly because we want some good news as well. So what is she doing? This is her university, and they are running clinical trials on finding a treatment for dengue. As I said, there's no treatment for dengue. So there's 2 vaccines. Maybe some of you have heard about these vaccines, but they're not available in the public health system. And there's some issues with them. We're not going to get into the technical details, but there's no treatment. And that treatment is not coming from the global north because it's not considered a market. Now, the travel market is interesting, so you can get a vaccine for travelers that want to go to the Philippines. But for people that live in these countries that are constantly exposed to these dengue outbreaks, there's no treatment. So what's happening is something really interesting, and this is why I love my job, and it's working with people like this, is we've formed a dengue alliance. So I'm just going to get a little technical here, but these are, for some of you might have heard of some of these organizations, these are basically the NIHs of these countries. So you have Sirdia Hospital in Thailand, which is the Royal Hospital, THSTI in India, it's a very important research institute, Fiocruz in Brazil, I think we have some Brazilians, so you know about Fiocruz, Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, Fiocruz, the Ministry of Health in Malaysia. These are all dengue endemic countries that have gathered together to run clinical trials in their countries for dengue treatment. What's fascinating here is that, again, the research isn't happening in labs in New Jersey, it's not happening in Europe, it's happening in these countries, and it's starting now. And what's the goal? The goal is, this is where we get a little technical, but it's an all-oral treatment, right? It's a pill. It's a simple pill that patients can take when they are diagnosed with moderate or, not severe dengue, but moderate early stage dengue. Like, you remember Paxlovid? It's kind of the Paxlovid for dengue. And the clinical trials are starting slowly, but in these countries. And basically, this is it's drug development, but I think there's a brighter future for dengue if these countries are empowered and if they can get the resources and I'd say the partnership to move these clinical trials on, and then maybe we'll have a treatment for dengue, which would be a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elon. All right. Quite the story. By the way, in my opinion, the science is out. We certainly know the mosquitoes can now reach Maine. And the mosquitoes also carry chikungunya, which is another hemorrhagic fever, and Zika, which you probably remember from the microcephaly cases in Florida a few years ago. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and fellow of the club, next, Dr. Stephen Picard, a geologist at the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Queen's College, with his students. He has researched past climate and oceanographic changes during the times as far back as 55 million years ago. Sorry about that. When CO2 was as high as it is predicted to be again at the end of the 21st century, this century. To do this research, he looks at microfossils, tiny little one cell organisms that come from the ocean, and also cores from the near shore and the deep ocean. And cores are big cylinders of soil that gets deposited over years, and every layer is a year or more, and he figures out when they're from. And he's gotten these cores from all over, but 4 times to Antarctica. Not a lot of us have made it that far for that many times. So here's Steve Picard.
And thank you. Well, thank you, Alex, and it's great to be here again. And so as Alex started talking about, I'm a geologist, and I'm a scientist, and I study climate changes from the deep past. Basically, as he was saying, I go back in time when CO2 was actually higher than today. And so if you think of scientists as like detectives, like a Sherlock Holmes, or if you like movies like Enola Holmes or whatever, we collect clues. We call them data. And we collect data all around the world. And in my case, I have to collect data since I'm going back in time. I'm not only just a detective, I'm also a time traveler. And so and my time traveling machine is set up in cores. So we can go back in time millions of years to look at this. And so, and my forte, what I look at most of the time is I look at how climate changes were affected by CO2 and specifically how the ice sheets were affected by climate. So in other words, I'm really looking at sea level changes. And so as a climate scientist, just to give you a little bit of a background about this, if you go back just 3 million, if you go back 3 million years ago, that was the last time that CO2 was as high as today. So what we've done in 140 years, Mother Nature couldn't do in millions and millions of years. And because CO2 was about 420 parts per million back then, the Earth was a little bit warmer than today because the Earth is still warming due to CO2. It's got a climate lag. And the seas rose about 40 feet. So let me put up a little graphic here for a little, and this is how high sea level got about 3 million years ago when CO2 was about as high as today. Now, I don't want you to go home tonight and go, Dr. Picard said, we're going to have 40 or 50 feet of sea level rise. This would take centuries, if not 1,000 years. But we wouldn't have to worry about that. If we just had 10% of that, okay, it would be a climate catastrophe. But the times I work on is further back in time. I like to look at when CO2 was actually higher than today. And so in the last time that it was higher than today was about 15 million years ago. So what we're going to do in a couple centuries, Mother Nature couldn't do in 15 million years. And sea level, because the Earth was about 2 to 4 degrees warmer than today, sea level was about 100 feet higher. Again, we don't need 100-foot sea level. That would take thousands of years, so don't worry, okay? You're probably thinking, well, how high is my house in sea level? This would take thousands of years, it's okay. But if we had just 5% of that, that's 5 feet. That would be a catastrophe. And I'm a Queens boy. I'm from the Rockaways, okay? 5 feet would be basically completely disastrous. And so where are we today? We have, let's just go a little further onto this. Okay. As a New Yorker and a climate scientist, let's talk about the elephant in the room. We talk about doom. Let's just look at some of the science facts of what's going on. This is CO2. The y-axis is concentration of CO2 from the Keeling curve from Hawaii. X-axis is from 1959 until today. And as you can see, the little wiggles is just seasonality. Don't worry about that. But you can see the trend. Do you see any flattening out? No. So all the good news that we keep hearing, look at the last couple of years. It's actually increasing a little bit over the last 10 to 15 years. We're seeing nothing happening that says, oh, we could relax, climate change is going to be fine. No. And in fact, we hear this every time there's a new conference on climate. The last one was the Paris Accord, but there was others a little after that. And you could see, did CO2 start dropping after that? No, of course not. And so this is where we are right now. And so one of the big things about, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, that's from the United Nations, where they bring the best scientists together. And every 5 years they come up with a new report, and each report gets a little bit more dire, more scary. And they said we need to keep the global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius, period. We're at 1.2. And so this is from Berlin. They have this, basically this carbon clock. And so how much time do we have left before we reach the threshold where that 1.5 degree threshold will be inevitable? Less than 6 years, okay? How many of you guys are hearing this on the corporate news? No, of course not. Okay, this is one of the things that we really need to hear. And so, and this is where we're at. This is not from a YouTube video, by the way. This is from the science. And so what is going to be happening in the near future? I study sea level. Let's talk about sea level in the future. And so this is from the NOAA, a report from last year, 3 to 6 feet by the end of the century. I come from Rockaway. That's the little peninsula up in the middle there. Most of it is underwater. Coney Island to the left is underwater. Long Beach, underwater. And you can just go any place in the world along the coastline. You'll see the same results. But that's NOAA. And they're actually, they're good. But I really have been reading about James Hansen. James Hansen is a NASA scientist from 1989 who went to Congress, and he's been publishing papers. This last paper from 2015, he had 9 co-authors, and those 9 co-authors were the best of the best climate scientists. And he said, no, it's not a couple of feet of sea level rise to expect, it's a couple of meters. So this map here shows sea level with a 10-foot sea level rise. He's been getting it right over the last 2 or 3 decades repeatedly. He says something and everyone goes, no, he's overreacting. And then 10 years later, they go, oh, he was right. So this is where we're at right now, okay? And so what are we going to do about this, okay? But before I get into what we can do about this, I don't have a lot of time. I actually said I was told like 5 minutes, 6 slides, and so I'm keeping it really short today. I'm a New Yorker. Normally, I talk a lot longer. Anyway, this is a report from the World Bank. Okay, the World Bank is not a care-leading, liberal, tree-hugging organization for the most part. Okay, and look at what they say here. Climate change will trigger internal migration of nearly 250 million people in the next 26 years, and that's not going to be like 2050. It's going to be 250 million people. It's going to start right about now. It's already, as a matter of fact, what's happening at the southern border. Lots of those migrants are coming out of Guatemala, and many of the part of it's political, but a big part of it is climate change. So this is what's happening, and this is the hotspots. Like I said, this is not from some sort of liberal organization. This is from the World Bank. How many of you have heard this on corporate news? Exactly. Okay? Exactly. And this is what is so upsetting for us climate scientists. And so, in fact, I say this all the time, especially I have about a dozen of my climate change students. I'm teaching a climate change class right now. Extra credit, by the way. Lots of extra credit. And if the average person, you know, the non-climate scientists knew what we know, us climate scientists know right now about what's going to happen, not in 80 years, in the next couple of decades. Okay? We're not talking about in the 2080 or 2090, we're talking about 2030, 2040, 2050. Okay? If you guys knew what I know, you would be picking up a pitchfork and going to your favorite TV news anchor and going, why aren't you telling us this? Or going to your favorite politician that you love voting for and going, why are you not trying to change this? That is what we're at right now. There's a Stanford scientist, climate scientist, who said within the next couple of decades, civilization as we know it will not exist. Okay? This is not from Idaho University, it's from Stanford University. So, and it's going to affect the poorest places in the world. Okay? Yeah. So are you guys crying yet or so depressed? Well, we got drinks later. But anyway, and so just to kind of wrap up about the idea about corporate news. So this is a dire crisis. It's actually the best scientists say this is a bigger crisis than World War II. Okay? So what is our news doing? Okay, so what percentage do you think that the news is actually reporting on climate change? You know, like 5%, 8%? Anybody want to yell out a number? Yeah, okay, let's take a look at it. 1.3. Okay, and that's a record year. Okay, previous years it was below 1%. Okay, that's where we're at right now. This is what our whoever you listen to, MSNBC or CNN. Maybe not Fox. But anyway, in general, this is what we're getting. And this is the most dire crisis humanity has ever faced. And so, with that in mind, I would like to conclude, because I know it's time, is the idea that at the Explorers Club, we are in a unique situation. Okay, you know, the Explorers Club has the best members in the world, right, guys? Okay, yeah, hello. And what I mean by that is that we have people in the TV industry, in the news industry. We have CEOs of major corporations. We have climate scientists. We have economists. We have filmmakers, et cetera, et cetera. Just imagine if we can get together and work together so we can try to publicize this, not to the people who are already convinced. Okay, I'm tired of preaching to the choir. Okay, but actually getting out to the average Joe Schmo person who doesn't know anything about this. And just imagine what we could do if the people were actually on our side with this. And with that, I'll take.
Thank you, Steve. And that's what Climate Week is all about. All right. It's health. If sea level rises and you are on a coast, I can assure you it's health. And we're seeing that with hurricanes. Where do you think hurricanes come from? And when hurricanes contaminate water and cholera comes in, that's health. So again, you got to think about that slide, all the causes all together, creating reality. The last but not least speaker, whose bio I don't have anymore. No, it's here. Is Emily Driscoll. An Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker and director and editor and the founder of Bonsai, is that pronounced correctly? Films, excuse me. She's director of video production at New York Presbyterian. Her films and series highlight environmental issues and scientific innovations, from exploring how to protect the waterways of the Navajo nations to sharing stories of the women engineer behind India's mission to Mars. She has produced and directed short films for Scientific American, Quantum Magazine, and Science Friday, among many other outlets. Her recent films include The Batman and the Woman of India and The Quest to Save the Parasites. Save Parasites, excuse me. Oh, wildlife parasites. They're not there. That was not there. She's not trying to save malaria is what she said. All right, okay. Today, Emily will tell us about sea level rise. That's why you're here after Steve. How sea level rise is changing the health of populations and ecosystems closer to us. There you go.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk about sea level rise and how it impacts human health a little closer by, which is right here in New York City. So we all know from this panel and being in the news that climate change has major impacts on human health, from heat-related illnesses, poor air quality, and more severe and frequent diseases. And so my job as a science filmmaker is to inform people about this and make an impact. So how do we convey this gravity that Dr. Pecker and other panelists here said so impactfully? How do we convey that to the public? And that's so important because the public is going to be the ones voting for politicians who create these policies that we desperately need to combat climate change. So storytelling and making a personal connection, those are, my tools, and I think some of the best way to spark emotion, which sparks action. So sea level rise, I want to talk about sea level rise and human health here in NYC, because we're all here right now, and sometimes climate change may seem like something on people think about in Bangladesh or on coastlines around the world, but it's already happening here, and we've already felt the impacts for years. And sea level rise can impact human health here by causing flooding and increased storm surges. So what does that do? That can contaminate our food and water and bring toxic chemicals and bacteria from the waterways into people's homes, onto the streets, and it can cause a lot of disruptions to health-related services, like overcrowding of hospitals, preventing access to the hospitals, even impacting the supply chains to get medications. So to talk about these, I want to go back, way back, to New York City before Europeans arrived, 1609, to talk about the harbor and to look at the harbor, what it was like, because this has a direct impact into how we can tackle this right now. Oh, sorry. And this is a short clip from a film I made a couple years ago called Shell Shocked, and it's about bringing oysters back to New York Harbor, not to eat, but to help restore the estuary.
The Hudson River area was theorized to have been the largest oyster rookery in the world. By some accounts, there were over 9 billion oysters.
New York City was the oyster capital of the world, which meant that it had over 350 square miles of reefs, which meant that all the water going in and out of New York was filtered by oysters. And it was supposed to be amazing.
Well, I dreamed I'd dance with Mary Mallon. Hi, Ford Mary. Hi, Ford Mary. Dreamed I'd dance with Mary Mallon down by an oyster barge.
It was estimated that half the world's oysters were in New York Harbor. We're used to oysters that are harvested at about 2.5, 3 years. This oyster was allowed to grow for 7 years.
The vast New York oyster beds created a rich and diverse ecosystem.
They used to say that you could walk across the Hudson River on the sturgeon's backs.
You had all of these oyster reefs, and with that, tons of fish and worms and crabs and other oysters and shellfish. Up the food chain, you had birds feeding off of the reefs and humans eating the fish from the reefs.
You had a much more vibrant ecosystem. That's what was described in all the accounts. A lot of that revolves around the fact that the Hudson River estuary was one of the richest oyster beds.
So what do oysters have to do with climate change and saving New York Harbor? Well, back in the day, there were 350 square miles of oyster reefs in New York Harbor, and these oyster reefs are three-dimensional reefs. So they have lots of nooks and crannies, and they slow down wave energy, and they create a buffer to protect against storm surges and flooding. And they filter water. One oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. So if you imagine 9 billion oysters in New York Harbor all working hard to filter the water, what that can accomplish. And they're ecosystem engineers. They create habitat and protection for other marine life. So this was an incredibly vibrant, diverse, protected area in 1609 when Henry Hudson sailed in, but over the centuries it started to decline, probably pretty much right away. The oysters were over-harvested, and land was filled in to make Manhattan bigger. The beaches disappeared, and shipping lanes were dredged and deepened so more ships and larger ships could enter into the harbor. And all of this made New York City the first mega city. 10 million people by 1930 were here. And along with that, unfortunately, came a lot of raw sewage, and a lot of that raw sewage ended up in New York Harbor. And at the same time, there were not a lot of environmental regulations at that time, so companies, industry followed suit and dumped their waste into the Hudson River. So this you can see by the 1970s, I mean, New York Harbor was just unswimmable, definitely no oysters around, very heavily polluted. And here's some dumping that was occurring in 1970, in the 1970s as well. So fast forward to today, the good news is after the Clean Water Act 1972 and a lot of the restoration efforts that have been going on since then, New York is the cleanest it's been in 150 years. But because of all this historic pollution, the changes of the underwater landscape, and some unique features of New York Harbor, we're very vulnerable to climate change. We have some unique problems, which include, here, just to give you a sense, here is what the climate projections for sea level rise are by 2100. And you can see even in the mild example, how much water, how much blue we're talking about here, especially as we just saw in the Rockaways and other marshy, low-lying areas. So some problems that are unique to New York Harbor include combined sewer overflows. So what that means is that there's one pipe for sewage and storm runoff that comes into the system. So on those days when there's heavy rain, the sewage and all that excess water travels to the wastewater treatment plants, but they can't handle all of that. So what happens is the excess gets discharged into New York Harbor. And what does that mean? That means 20 billion gallons of raw sewage are going into New York Harbor every year. And of course, this has a lot of health risks like pollutants, waterborne diseases, pathogens, viruses, bacteria, all over the Hudson. We definitely should not be, fishing during those times or interacting with the water, clearly. And also we have aging infrastructure. The CSOs are old, as are a lot of the water pipes. So with sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, these can corrode the pipes and infiltrate our water systems. We also have some Superfund sites here, including Newtown Creek, which I lived in Greenpoint several years ago, and I didn't realize there were 20 million gallons of oil beneath my feet there. So this is the largest oil spill in US history, and it was ongoing for 100 years, only discovered in 1970. They are cleaning it up now, but it's still a major problem. And the Gowanus Canal, an industrial site from the 19th century, also a Superfund site. And these have a lot of problems with chronic health problems, including respiratory problems, gastrointestinal problems. And we saw what could happen with Hurricane Sandy in 2012 because both of these areas were flooded and brought these contaminants into the streets, into people's basements. But not only that, it stirs the water around and disperses those pollutants in other areas. So what can we do about all of this? We need to communicate this, and we need to see how we can remedy this. But luckily, New York, and I think New York is in a great place. They should be a pioneer. They've been a pioneer in so many other places, so this is an opportunity for them to do so with climate change. And we're already working on things here. We're updating our infrastructure, especially our underwater infrastructure, and building codes, so new buildings have to be built higher. We're hoping to, or New York City is hoping to end sewage overflows by 2060. And they're doing that a lot with green infrastructure. So, for example, restoring creeks in the Bronx that used to be there in 1609, so they can collect rainwater, so not as much rainwater gets into the CSOs, or green roofs, or more parks to absorb some of that excess seawater. And then that brings us back to the oysters. So how can oysters be a part of this? Well, there's the Billion Oyster Project, and they have been working for many years to bring oysters back to New York Harbor. And they have 18 sites around New York City in the water. And they work with students, volunteers, and many other people to plant oysters. And again, these will help diminish wave energy and filter water, clean the water when these overflows happen. And right now there's 100 million oysters in New York Harbor thanks to this program. And it's working. In 2010, whales returned to the harbor. So all of this, knowing all of this, how do we communicate this, and how do we make sure that we do act? Because if we don't act, there are numerous costs, uncalculable costs, and varied costs, economic, human, health, and ecological. I mean, climate migrations, the economic cost is going to be astronomical between constantly paying for storms and rebuilding and property values, things that people care about, human costs, and the health costs, the waterborne illnesses, the heat-related illnesses coming back, and of course the ecological costs of species being displaced, especially just like humans. So coastal cities around the world, and everyone really needs to act. And I just think it's interesting that one of the solutions may have been here the whole time, maybe not in front of us, but underneath the water, which is the oyster. So we all need to work together and look to nature and think about how to communicate these problems so that we can really protect against the effects of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. By the way, when the sea level rises, the water goes through the same channels that go up through the storm drains. So if you thought that a wall was going to stop flooding of Manhattan, think again. Yeah, this is a really happy panel. We're going to now have all our speakers come up and take our chairs, and we're going to take some questions. Realize we're a little bit over time, but we started late, so we're just going to do a Q&A, and I'm going to bring the microphone to whomever wants to ask a question, and then we'll move on. So, questions from our students? There you go. Extra credit.
What was the first speaker's name?
Marie.
Professor Marie, I wanted to ask, how is data collected and how is it evaluated?
Yeah, great question. So this past summer and the summer before, I led a team of field researchers, and we collected literally 20,000 ticks from all over New York City, and Long Island. And the method is actually with a cloth that you drag over the ground in there's specific zones that we'll drag to standardize it, to compare. And then we also have wildlife camera traps at a bunch of different sites to get the wildlife host community. I also live trapped small mammals and pulled the ticks off of them. And then created a social survey with a team of social scientists that we conducted in parks. So lots of mixed methods, but that's how we did it.
And then you test them for Lyme?
Yes, and then we test them for different tick-borne pathogens, which include Lyme disease, which is a bacteria, and then there's a few other bacterial pathogens that are kind of rising right now, such as anaplasmosis, babesiosis, and then we're also going to be testing for Poisson virus, which is pretty rare, but it's quite deadly and
Want to tell us about
rising.
anaplasmosis for a second?
What?
Want to tell us about anaplasmosis for a sec?
Anaplasmosis? Sure. Well, it's another tick-borne pathogen with kind of similar general malaise type symptoms, so a bit hard to diagnose, but it's quite urban associated. So we're seeing an increase in these urban areas that we haven't really seen before. Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead.
This is kind of a actually, thank you all for speaking. It's been really informative. Two-pronged questions.
Are you an academic by any chance? Three-part question?
Yeah.
That's an academic thing.
How long can a tick live without feeding on blood, approximately? And what's the eco-friendly preventative to, stop them from being around you, or let's kill them, kill those bugs? Which I really don't want to do.
Yeah, so ticks actually have a really interesting and complex life cycle that I didn't really get into here, but they go through 3 different life stages, which I brought just the nymphs and adults, but they start as the adult lays eggs, and then they hatch into larvae. And at each life stage, they only need 1 blood meal. So they actually don't feed very much, and they can survive they live about 3 years here. It's a 3-year life cycle. Yeah, pretty long time. And they only feed twice in their, 2 to 3 times in their whole life at each life stage. So, and they overwinter underground. But you can, the best way to protect yourself is really to check yourself for ticks after being outdoors in areas where there might be ticks, to wear long pants, socks, and then I would actually recommend, if you're going to use a repellent, it's called permethrin, and you treat your clothing with it, and then the ticks don't survive when they come into contact with it. Yeah.
Permethrin?
Yeah.
Or
Permethrin.
P-E-R-M-E?
It's the way to go.
P-H-R-I-N.
Yeah. And then we're working on some ecological interventions in Suffolk County right now to, that would be maybe more environmentally friendly, not spraying pesticides, because that's obviously an environmental concern for other reasons, but even just removing like not letting leaf litter pile up in people's yards. And there's really too many deer. There's no other way to say it. There's too many deer. But we're working either on, there's a program right now in Staten Island that's giving vasectomies to deer. It's been kind of controversial, but that's one way to control populations and reduce ticks. Yeah, it's complicated.
And freezes aren't happening anymore that used to kill larvae, right?
Yes, with the higher temperatures, the ticks are surviving longer. More of them are surviving on to the next life stage, and they're looking for hosts for a longer period of time. So it's just, it's kind of a perfect storm for their diseases to be rising, but it's also a very interesting time and an opportunity to look into ways to prevent it.
All right, sorry.
Thank you for the question.
Mr. Gray.
This is to Elon. Why don't you just explain what Dindy does, what you're trying to accomplish? You really didn't get into that so much as, well, do you have this dengue disease out there and so on, but you're a hell of a lot bigger than that. So what is the hell of a lot of the things that you do?
So thanks. So I think there's a lot going on here, right? So we don't have the solution to dengue. You know, I didn't have time to go into the technical details. There's 2 vaccines, as I said. There was a question around prevention as well, which was interesting. I'm sure you've heard about Bill Gates releasing a bunch of genetically modified mosquitoes. This is another technical thing. It's Wolbachia. But there are preventative measures, but that's not going to be enough. The mosquitoes are going to continue to spread. So as we learned with COVID, we need a vaccine. We had those. We need a quick diagnostic. We had those pretty quick. And you need a treatment. It's what any doctor needs. There is no treatment for dengue, so there's no way to manage patients now. These hospital wards are slammed because there's no treatment for dengue. So that's what we're doing. Now, why there is no treatment of dengue, that's a different story. That's neglect, that's pharmaceutical neglect, that's markets. But what are we doing? So this is, I'm happy to talk to anyone, but there's this Dengue Alliance, right? So these are these endemic, global South countries. The NIHs of all these countries are uniting to run clinical trials. So this is what didn't happen during COVID, you'll know. Remember what happened? The vaccines got to the US and North America first, and the rest of the world was last online. And millions of people died. So what we're trying to do now is reverse that, where the next pandemic is without doubt going to be dengue. It won't kill as much as COVID did, but it'll destroy health systems, as you saw. So in order to tackle that, that's what's happening. We're trying to come up with a treatment in advance. So it's complicated, but
so it's already a pandemic. It's in many countries. So it's just not a pandemic in the north of the global north, and that's why we don't call it a pandemic, but it's a pandemic.
Yep.
Also, there was a vaccine for Lyme disease, and anybody want to guess why there is no longer a vaccine for Lyme disease? Anybody?
It was eradicated in
the... Nope, that definitely was not the reason. Nope, sorry. Extra credit for trying, though. Yeah, want to try?
Disease evolved?
Nope. Yep. Nope, you're not immune to Lyme disease. So, what happened during COVID when we got the vaccine? No. Exactly. Misinformation. Exactly. And in fact, that is why people were misinformed, and a giant campaign, anti-vaccination campaign, made the vaccine essentially unused, and companies stopped producing it. So why we're here today, informing the public about something that needs to happen. This is the science. Here's the expert. There's a question in the back. Julie Chase.
Hi. So I was actually going to ask a question about the vaccine, but let's backtrack. Medicine is notorious for being very poor at diagnosing Lyme disease. And I mean, the amount of false negatives is extremely high, and subsequently we get very ill people down the line. Any news on that front? and better diagnosis?
Yeah, so not really on the diagnostic front, which is why I'm personally very interested in the prevention side because, as you said, it's very difficult to diagnose. So a little bit of background on the bacteria itself. It's called a spirochete bacteria, which there aren't many like that. Syphilis is another example, and it's in the shape of a spiral. And it literally like corkscrews into the tissue. So it doesn't go into the bloodstream like most other, like a lot of other pathogens. And so you can only test for it with antibody tests, which are just not great. And I mean, I'm not as familiar on the medical side of advancement there, but currently the tests would not diagnose it until several weeks after you've already been infected. And really the key to preventing kind of these longer lasting effects that you may have been hearing about and that make people really ill is quickly diagnosing it and getting it out of your system, which is very doable with an antibiotic, but it's often not diagnosed quickly enough. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much to say there, but I will say on the vaccine front, so Pfizer is developing a new vaccine that is supposed to be better in terms of efficacy and as well as, they've learned a lot from the COVID vaccine rollout in terms of getting public on board. So that should be available to folks in 2027.
And please vaccinate
Yeah.
your dogs too. And also
Yourselves.
yes, exactly, but vaccinate your dogs, use permethrin on their collar or whatever it is, because the dogs will bring the ticks with you back to the house. If you're not checking your dog, you're not checking yourself. Last question.
Of the ticks and the mosquitoes that you test, what percentage of them would be bearing the disease?
Well, not all of them are, but about 20 to 30% of the nymphal ticks, which is what we test. The adults we actually don't test, but it's going to be about double because they've had 2 opportunities. Oh yeah, I'm not working specifically with that. I don't know if you have an answer there.
I don't know if you know this, but how many? So if there are mosquito surveys, which Jeffrey Shaman at Columbia is doing this, or used to do this before he became dean of the climate school. If you collect dengue, if you collect it as a GFT, essentially, how many of them on percentage? I mean,
how many are dengue positive? I mean, it's so massive. So there's a study actually going on in Colombia right now at the Peset University in Medellin, I think, right? Medellin, yeah, thanks. And there's a study going on in Sri Lanka as well, but there's no global study on that. It's still the data is just coming and coming and coming as the outbreaks keep on happening. And as I said, the hospitals are slammed, so they don't have time to conduct research because they're too busy staying up all night, putting IV in people.
So thank you for coming. We gotta close. Unfortunately, we are way over time. We did start a little late, but last thoughts. Prevention is the key, as all of the papers have shown, whether it is to change our policies or, in fact, change our ways we walk our dogs and go into the woods. Prevention, and we spend 95% of our dollars on treatment in this country, only 5% on prevention. Imagine flipping that around. Thank you for coming.